Vivid verses.
The Roaches owned the apartment at 1247 Hollister Street long before Vance did. They owned the cracked linoleum, the water-stained ceiling, the gap beneath the bathroom door where they streamed in like commuters at rush hour. They were Baltimore natives, generational residents, and they moved through the darkness with the confidence of landlords. Vance learned to sleep motionless. Movement attracted them. At 6 years old, he discovered that if he lay perfectly still, they'd crawl over him like he was just another piece of broken furniture. The trick was not to flinch. Never flinch. His mother, Crystal, spent most nights on the sagging couch, occasionally coherent, more often lost in whatever chemical piece she'd managed to score. The television provided the apartment's only reliable light, casting blue shadows across her gaunt face. Vance had stopped expecting conversation from her around the time he'd learned to tie his shoes. She was a ghost haunting her own life, and he was the unexpected witness. His father was a name on a birth certificate filed somewhere in the city's bureaucratic maze. Nothing more. The first book Vance ever read was a water-damaged copy of the Baltimore Chronicle he'd found in the dumpster behind their building. He was 7. The newspaper smelled like coffee grounds and something sweet that might have been rotting fruit, but the words were intact. He spread it across the sticky kitchen table and began the slow work of decoding. CITY City, CUNCL, Council, VOT Vote. The articles made little sense at first, something about zoning laws and development contracts, but the act of reading them felt like picking a lock. Each word was a tumbler falling into place, and behind the lock was a world that operated on rules he could learn. He collected newspapers religiously after that. The morning editions that people discarded at bus stops, the weekend supplements left on park benches, the circulars that piled up in apartment lobbies. He learned about things that had nothing to do with Hollister Street. Corporate mergers, congressional hearings, international trade agreements. The words constructed a parallel reality, clean and logical, where problems had solutions and effects followed causes. His mother noticed once, during a rare lucid spell, "Why you always reading that trash?" She was eating cereal without milk, the spoon scraping against the bowl. "Learning," Vance said. "Learning what?" "How to be poor and mad about it." He didn't answer. He was reading an article about a class action lawsuit against a pharmaceutical company. The plaintiffs had won $47 million. He didn't know what he'd do with that information yet, but he filed it away. School was a different kind of education. Vance excelled effortlessly at the academic work. Math, reading, science, all of it came to him like breathing. But excellence at Douglas Elementary earned you nothing except attention, and attention at Douglas meant trouble. The first beating came when he scored perfect on a state assessment test in 3rd grade. Mrs. Henderson, the teacher, had made the mistake of praising him in front of the class. "Vance is showing us all what's possible with hard work," she'd said, holding up his test paper. 3 boys caught him after school. Marcus Webb, Darnell Thompson, and Marcus's cousin, whose name Vance never learned. They beat him methodically in the alley behind the playground, not frenzied but workmanlike, until his lips split and his ribs sang with pain. "Think you better than us?" Marcus had asked, punctuating each word with another blow. Vance said nothing. He learned from the Roaches, don't flinch, don't react, wait for it to pass. At home, his mother saw the bruises and accused him of fighting. "Can't stay out of trouble for one goddamn day," she said, and hit him again, this time with the back of her hand, hard enough that his head snapped sideways. She's high, Vance thought, studying her dilated pupils, the way she swayed slightly even though she was sitting down. She won't remember this tomorrow. He was right. She didn't. The beatings became routine, from classmates when he performed too well, from his mother when her supply ran dry, or when the bills piled up, or when she simply needed something to hit. Vance learned to calculate the angles. At school, he began deliberately missing questions on tests. Not enough to fail, but enough to hover in the invisible middle where no one noticed. He varied the pattern so no teacher would suspect. Question 3 wrong this time, question 7 next time, never the same sequence. At home, he learned to read Crystal's moods, to predict the storm fronts before they arrived. When she came through the door, moving too quickly, talking too loud, he made himself small. When she came through the door, moving too slowly, eyes unfocused, he became her caretaker, guiding her to the couch, removing her shoes, making sure she was positioned so she wouldn't choke if she vomited. The mathematics of survival. Variables and constants. Cause and effect. By the time he turned 13, Vance had a system. He'd found work washing dishes at a diner called Rosie's, 3 blocks from the apartment. The owner, an exhausted Korean woman named Mrs. Park, paid him under the table and didn't ask questions when he showed up with bruises. He worked Tuesday through Thursday evenings, 5 to 10, earning $6 an hour that he hid in a hole he'd carved behind the bathroom baseboard. Fridays and Saturdays, he cleaned offices downtown for a janitorial company that was desperate enough for workers that they didn't verify his age too carefully. The supervisor, a heavy-set man named Dale, had looked at Vance's forged work permit, then at Vance, then back at the permit. "You're small for 16, Dale had said. "I get the job done," Vance had replied. Dale had shrugged and handed him a mop. Sundays, he stocked shelves at a corner market run by an elderly Pakistani couple. Mr. Ansari paid him in cash and let him take home expired food that would otherwise be thrown away. Between the 3 jobs and school, Vance slept maybe 5 hours a night. He learned to function on caffeine and adrenaline, to do his homework in stolen moments, on the bus, during lunch, in the 15-minute gaps between shifts. His grades stayed perfect despite his careful camouflage because he'd realized something crucial. The standardized tests were anonymous. He could score perfectly on those without anyone knowing it was him. The money accumulated slowly in its hiding place. Vance had a number in mind, $10,000. Enough for first and last month's rent on a studio apartment, enough for a security deposit, enough for a buffer. Enough to leave. He was 14 when he met Mr. Raymond Casper, the night janitor at the Westfield Public Library. The library stayed open until 8 on weekdays, but Mr. Casper didn't finish his cleaning rounds until 11. Vance had discovered this one Thursday when he'd hidden in the bathroom at closing time, waiting for the staff to leave. He'd needed access to the law section. A civil case he'd read about in the newspaper had referenced a Supreme Court precedent he wanted to understand, and the internet at school was too restricted to be useful. He'd emerged from the bathroom at 8:15, expecting an empty building. Instead, he'd found Mr. Casper watching him from beside a book cart, arms folded. Mr. Casper was somewhere in his 60s, black, with gray threading his close-cropped hair and sharp eyes that missed nothing. "Son," he'd said, "you know what trespassing is?" Vance had calculated his options in the 2 seconds it took Mr. Casper to finish speaking. Running would accomplish nothing. Mr. Casper was between him and the door. Lying would be insulting to both of them. That left the truth, or at least a version of it. "Yes, sir. It's the unlawful entry onto property owned by another party. I needed to research something for school." Mr. Casper had studied him for a long moment. "For school." "Yes, sir. What grade you in?" "Ninth. And 9th grade has you researching law cases after the library closes? The assignment's on constitutional rights. I want to go deeper than the textbook." Another long pause. Then Mr. Casper had nodded toward the law section. "You've got until I finish my rounds. 10:30. Then you leave out the back door, quiet." And this never happened. "We clear." "Yes, sir." It became a pattern. Twice a week, Vance would slip in a library before closing and wait. Mr. Casper never acknowledged him directly during these visits, but he always made sure the law section light stayed on, and he always finished his rounds at exactly 10:30. 3 months into this arrangement, Mr. Casper found Vance asleep at one of the study tables, head pillowed on a copy of constitutional law, principles and policies. It was a Friday night. Vance had worked both his other jobs that day, then come to the library to finish an essay. His body had simply quit. He woke to Mr. Casper shaking his shoulder gently. "Son, you can't sleep here." Vance had sat up disoriented. "I'm sorry. I'll leave. When's the last time you slept in a bed?" The question was so unexpected that Vance answered honestly. "Tuesday, maybe Monday." Mr. Casper had looked at him for a long time. Then he'd sighed, the sound of a man making a decision he knew would complicate his life. "There's a storage room on the 3rd floor. Old study carrels, broken computers, that kind of thing. It's got a door that locks from the inside. If someone were to sleep there, and I'm not saying they should, they need to be gone before the morning staff arrives at 7. And they need to make damn sure no one ever knew about it." Vance had felt something unfamiliar tighten in his chest. Not quite hope, but adjacent to it. "Why would you let me do that?" "Because I've seen you reading contracts and case law like other kids read comic books. Because you've got 3 different jobs and you're still pulling straight A's. Because I was 16 once, sleeping in places I shouldn't, and someone gave me a chance." Mr. Casper had pulled a key from his ring. "Lock click's funny. You gotta jiggle it twice to the left. And son, don't make me regret this." "I won't, sir." He never did. The storage room became Vance's real home. He'd leave the apartment on Hollister Street each evening, telling Crystal, on the rare occasions she was conscious enough to ask, that he was staying at a friend's house. She never questioned it. He brought his hidden money to the library, relocating it to a vent in the storage room, where it continued to grow. He slept on a nest of old curtains and a deflated gym mat, woke at 6, washed in the library bathroom, and left before the staff arrived. He studied law with a focus that bordered on obsession. Not just constitutional law anymore, but contracts, torts, civil procedure, criminal law. He read Supreme Court decisions like literature, analyzing the logic, the rhetoric, the dissents. By the time he was 16, Vance had internalized something fundamental. The law was a game with explicit rules, and games with explicit rules could be won. Unlike the chaotic violence of Hollister Street, unlike the chemical roulette of his mother's moods, the law was predictable. Precedent built on precedent. Arguments had structure. Evidence mattered. He could win at this. The letter from Whitmore College arrived on a Tuesday in April of Vance's senior year. Mr. Casper had helped him with the applications, not by writing them, but by unlocking the library after hours and making sure Vance had access to the computers and printers. Vance had applied to 14 schools, all with full need-based aid programs, all with acceptance rates below 15%. Whitmore had been the reach of reaches. A small liberal arts college in Vermont with an endowment larger than some countries' GDP and a reputation for producing senators, federal judges, and the occasional president. Dear Mr. Walker, on behalf of the admissions committee, I am delighted to offer you admission to Whitmore College's class of 2015. Vance read it 3 times, looking for the catch. There had to be a catch. Your demonstrated academic excellence, combined with the remarkable resilience you've shown in overcoming significant personal challenges, makes you exactly the kind of student Whitmore seeks to educate. The financial aid package was on the 2nd page. Full tuition, room, and board. A stipend for books and personal expenses. Summer funding for internships. The catch, Vance realized, was that he'd actually done it. Mr. Casper found him still staring at the letter an hour later. "Well," the old man asked. "Full ride," Vance said. His voice sounded strange to his own ears. "They're paying for everything." Mr. Casper smiled, the first real smile Vance had ever seen from him. Damn right they are. You earned it. I need to tell my mother. You need to? Vance considered this. No, but I should. He went to the apartment on Hollister Street one last time. Krista was on the couch, as always, watching a game show with the sound too loud. The roaches scattered when he opened the door. "Ma," he said. She didn't look away from the television. "What?" "I got into college. Full scholarship. I'm leaving in August." Now she looked at him. Her eyes were clearer than usual, which somehow made the conversation worse. "College," she repeated. "Yeah. What? You think you're better than this now?" "Better than me? I've always been better than this," Vance thought, but he said, "I think I want something different." "Different? Right." She laughed, a sound like tearing paper. "You'll be back. They'll chew you up and spit you out, those rich kids. You don't belong there." Vance looked at her, really looked at her, maybe for the first time in years. She was 41 years old and looked 60. Her teeth were rotting. Her hands shook. She'd chosen this, chosen it every day for as long as he'd been alive, and she was angry at him for refusing to make the same choice. "You're probably right," he said, because there was no point in arguing. "I'll send you money when I can." He never did, and he never went back. Whitmore College sat on 300 acres of Vermont hillside, like a monastery dedicated to the worship of old money. The buildings were brick and ivy. The lawns were maintained with religious fervor, and the student body moved through it all with the casual entitlement of people who never had to wonder where their next meal was coming from. Vance arrived with 2 duffel bags and the $11,000 he'd saved, which he immediately deposited into the student credit union account Whitmore had set up for him. He'd Googled every aspect of college life he could think of, from how to navigate a dining hall to what business casual meant, but there was no preparation for the lived reality of being surrounded by wealth so profound it was invisible to the people who had it. His roommate, Carter Bainbridge III, introduced himself by asking which prep school Vance had attended. "Public school in Baltimore," Vance had said. "Oh." Carter's face had done something complicated. "Well, that's cool, man. Real cool. Very authentic." Authentic, Vance noted, as if poverty were a lifestyle choice, like being vegan. He spent the first month in careful observation, cataloging the invisible rules, the way certain brands were acceptable and others weren't. The casual references to summer homes and ski trips that weren't meant to show off but simply were. The strange dialect they all spoke, full of understatement and irony and references to things Vance had never heard of. He learned it the way he'd learned everything else, through ruthless pattern recognition and repetition. He bought the right clothes at Goodwill stores 2 towns over, breaking them in so they didn't look new. He listened more than he spoke, absorbing vocabulary and cadence. He joined the debate team because it was one of the few spaces where his background was irrelevant. All that mattered was the quality of your argument. He was good at arguments. By sophomore year, he made himself nearly invisible in his difference. Not because he was trying to hide who he was, but because he'd learned to make people comfortable around him while giving away nothing essential. He maintained a 4.0 GPA, joined the pre-law society, and worked 2 campus jobs despite his stipend because the habit of working was too ingrained to break. It was junior year when he met Natalie Ashford. She was everything Whitmore represented: old Philadelphia money, family name on buildings, the kind of beauty that came from generations of good nutrition and orthodontia. She sat next to him in constitutional law seminar and argued with him about Marbury versus Madison with the fierce joy of someone who'd never had to argue about anything that actually mattered. "You're wrong about judicial review," she'd said after class, following him out of the building. Marshall wasn't creating a power from nothing. It's implicit in Article 3. "Implicit isn't explicit," Vance had replied. And Marshall knew exactly what he was doing, creating a check on the other branches that the framers never intended. "Coffee," she'd said. We're continuing this over coffee. They did, and then over dinner, and then over breakfast. Dating Natalie was like learning a new language while someone constantly corrected your grammar. She had opinions about everything: how he dressed, where they ate, what he ordered when they got there. She introduced him to her friends as the smartest person at Whitmore, which sounded like a compliment but felt like an exhibit label. 3 months in, she invited him home for Thanksgiving. The Ashford house was in Bryn Mawr, a sprawling stone affair with actual servants and a dining room that could seat 20. Natalie's father, Bradford, was a federal appellate judge. Her mother, Caroline, chaired 3 nonprofit boards and played tennis at a club that had only recently started admitting Jews. Dinner was an interrogation disguised as polite conversation. "So, Vance," Bradford had said, carving a turkey that probably cost more than a month's rent at Hollister Street. "Natalie tells me you're interested in law." "Yes, sir. I'm planning to apply to law schools next year." "Excellent. Which schools are you considering?" "Yale, Harvard, Stanford, Columbia, and NYU as backups." "Ambitious." Bradford had smiled approvingly. "And after that, corporate law, academia, litigation, sir, criminal defense, or civil rights work." The smile had frozen slightly. "That's noble, though I hope you'll keep your options open. The most intellectually stimulating work in law happens in appellate litigation, not in the trenches." Translation: "Don't waste your Whitmore education on poor people," Vance had thought, but he just nodded politely. The real conversation happened later, after dinner, when Natalie found him on the terrace. "You were perfect," she'd said, kissing him. "Daddy loved you." "Did he? Well, he will, once you've had time to mature a bit." Vance had looked at her carefully. "Mature how?" "You know." She waved a hand vaguely. "Learn how things work. The connections you make, the firms you join, that matters. You can't just charge off being some public defender." "That's exactly what I'm planning to do. At first, maybe, for experience. But Vance, you're too talented to spend your career on court-appointed cases. You could make a real impact at a place like Sullivan and Chase, working on landmark cases that actually change things." "Like corporate mergers?" She'd missed his tone entirely. "Well, yes. The law that shapes commerce shapes society. You understand that." He'd understood perfectly. "What if I don't want that?" "Don't be stubborn. I'm trying to help you see the bigger picture." The word stubborn was interesting. It suggested that disagreement was a character flaw to be corrected, not a legitimate difference in values. "Nat," he'd said carefully, "if we're going to keep seeing each other, you need to understand something. I'm not a project. I'm not rough edges that need smoothing. This is who I am. I'm not trying to change you." "Yes, you are. You've been trying since we met. The clothes, the restaurants, the way I talk about my background. You want me packaged into something your parents can understand." Her face had flushed. "That's not fair, isn't it? Tell me honestly, would you want your father to know I grew up sleeping on a library floor because my mother was too high to notice I was gone?" Silence. "That's what I thought," Vance had said, and the thing was, he wasn't even angry. Anger required investment in an outcome, and he'd already calculated where this was going. "Vance, I love you, but you have to meet me halfway. If you're going to be part of my life, part of my family, there are certain expectations." "I hear what you're saying," he'd replied, "and I think we want different things." They'd broken up that night. Natalie had cried, which surprised him. He thought she'd be relieved. But people were endlessly complex about their contradictions. She genuinely believed she loved him while simultaneously believing he needed to be fundamentally different to be acceptable. He'd felt nothing about it beyond a mild disappointment at being right. Yale Law School accepted him with a full scholarship and a personal note from the dean. Harvard and Stanford made similar offers. Vance chose Yale because it was furthest from both Baltimore and Whitmore, and because its reputation in public interest law was unmatched. Law school was different from Whitmore. The wealth was still there, but it was sublimated beneath a veneer of meritocracy. What mattered was how you performed in class, how you did on the journal write-on competition, whether you made law review. The playing field wasn't level, but the game had clearer rules. Vance dominated. He made law review at the end of his first year, published a note on qualified immunity doctrine that got cited in his Sixth Circuit opinion, and spent his 1L summer at the ACLU's national office in New York. His 2L summer was at a white shoe firm in D.C., not because he wanted to work there, but because the experience and connections would be useful later. It was during 2L year that he met Rebecca Chon. She was in his ethical lawyering seminar, a small, fierce woman from Seattle who argued like she was trying to win a war. They were paired together for a mock trial exercise, and she'd approached the preparation with military precision. "You take opening, I'll take closing," she'd said. "We need to establish the emotional stakes early, then hammer the legal theory home at the end." They'd won the exercise. Afterward, she'd invited him to get drinks with her study group. The relationship developed gradually, study sessions that turned into dinners that turned into weekends. Rebecca was brilliant and driven, and she understood ambition in a way Natalie never had. She was going to be a prosecutor, she told him. Start at a U.S. attorney's office, make a name, then transition into politics. She had a 10-year plan. "What about you?" she'd asked one night, lying in his bed in the apartment he'd rented off campus. "Where do you see yourself in 10 years? "Running my own practice," Vance had said. "Criminal defense, civil rights litigation, maybe some appellate work. Taking cases that matter. That's a lot of pro bono. Some pro bono. Some paying clients. Enough to keep the lights on." She'd traced a finger down his chest. "You could do better than that. With your grades, you could write your ticket anywhere. Federal clerkship, Supreme Court clerkship even. Then any firm in the country." "I don't want any firm in the country." "Why not? You could make partner somewhere in 5 years. Be pulling 7 figures by the time you're 35. And defending corporations against class actions? No thanks. It's not all corporate defense. There are white-collar criminal defense practices, appellate boutiques." "Rebecca," he'd turned to look at her. "Why do you care what I do?" "Because I care about you. Because I want you to reach your potential. This is my potential. This is what I want." She'd sat up, pulling the sheet around herself. Is it some kind of, I don't know, survivor's guilt thing? Like you have to stay connected to where you came from. It's not guilt. It's purpose. Purpose. She'd said it like the word tasted strange. "Vance, you're one of the best legal minds at Yale. You could shape policy, influence legislation, actually change systems instead of just treating symptoms. By prosecuting drug offenses and white-collar crimes. By building a career that gives me a platform, which is more than you'll get representing defendants who can't pay you." There it was. The fundamental incompatibility dressed up as concern. "Rebecca," he'd said, "I think we want different things from our careers and from our lives. So what? You're just going to throw away what we have because I suggested you aim higher?" "I'm not aiming higher. I'm aiming where I want to aim." "You're being stubborn." That word again. The same one Natalie had used. "You're afraid of commitment," Rebecca had continued, warming to her argument. "You're afraid that if you let yourself want more, want different things, it means you're betraying something. But that's not growth, Vance. That's stagnation." He'd sat up, studying her. She believed what she was saying. She'd constructed a narrative where his choices were pathology and hers were health, and no amount of explanation would penetrate that. "I hear that's how you feel," he'd said. "That's it? That's all you have to say? What would you like me to say? I'd like you to fight for us. I'd like you to consider that maybe I have a point. I have considered it. I disagree." She'd gotten dressed in angry silence and left. They tried to be civil for the rest of the semester, but it was uncomfortable for both of them, so they simply stopped talking. Vance heard later that she'd graduated Order of the Coif and taken a job at the Southern District of New York. He wished her well and meant it and never thought about her again. Vance graduated from Yale with honors, published 3 more law review articles, and turned down clerkship offers from 2 federal appellate judges to start his own practice in Austin, Texas. Austin was random enough to be strategic, a growing city with a significant immigrant population, ongoing civil rights issues, and no one who knew him from before. He rented office space above a Vietnamese restaurant, hired a part-time paralegal named Sandra who'd been trying to break into legal work for 5 years, and put out his shingle. Vance Walker, attorney at law. The first 2 years were brutal. He took court appointments, handled small-time criminal cases, did contract review for small businesses, anything to keep money coming in. He won more than he lost, built a reputation for thorough preparation and unflappable courtroom presence, and slowly began attracting better cases. The turning point came in his 3rd year, when a public defender named Maria Gutierrez called him about a case she was too swamped to handle. "Kid named Tyrell Hayes," she'd said, 17 years old, charged with armed robbery of a convenience store. Says he's innocent, has an alibi, but the evidence looks bad. Surveillance footage, witness ID, recovered property. Standard appointed rate, probably going to trial. "What makes you think he's actually innocent?" Vance had asked. "My gut, and the fact that his alibi is his grandmother, who's the most honest person I've ever met. She swears he was with her when it happened, 60 miles away. But she's 83 and black, and the jury's going to think she's lying to protect him." Vance had taken the case. The prosecution's evidence was strong on the surface. Surveillance footage showed someone Tyrell's approximate height and build entering the store with a gun. The clerk had identified Tyrell in a photo array. A jacket matching the one in the surveillance footage had been found in Tyrell's bedroom, and $300 in cash, close to the amount stolen, was in his backpack. But Vance had learned to look for inconsistencies the way he'd once learned to read newspapers. And the inconsistencies were there. The surveillance footage was grainy, shot from an angle that obscured the perpetrator's face. The timestamp on the footage showed 9:47 p.m. Tyrell's grandmother, Mrs. Lucille Hayes, said Tyrell had been at her house in Taylor, 60 miles away, from 7 p.m. until past midnight, helping her organize her late husband's belongings. The photo array was questionable. The detective had included 5 photos of young black men, but Tyrell was the only one in the array wearing a white T-shirt, the same color shirt the clerk had described. The jacket was a common brand sold at dozens of stores. The cash could have been from Tyrell's part-time job at a fast food restaurant, which paid under the table. None of it was definitive. But Vance had realized something. The prosecution's case relied on a chain of assumptions that looked solid but wasn't. He'd started with the surveillance footage. He'd hired a video analyst who determined that the timestamp on the convenience store security system was incorrect. It was running 17 minutes slow because of a power outage 3 weeks earlier that hadn't been properly reset. The actual time of the robbery was 10:04 p.m., not 9:47 p.m., which meant Tyrell would have had to leave his grandmother's house by 9 p.m. at the latest to make it to Austin by 10:04 p.m. But Tyrell's phone records showed he'd been texting his girlfriend from his grandmother's address at 9:23 p.m. The cell tower data confirmed it. Vance had then tracked down the convenience store clerk and interviewed him carefully. The clerk was 19, working his first job, and had been held at gunpoint for 90 seconds. The photo array had been shown to him 3 days after the incident. "Did you tell the detective you were certain about the identification?" Vance had asked. He asked if I recognized anyone. I said the guy looked similar. He asked if I was sure, and I said maybe. I don't know, I was scared. "Similar how?" I don't know. Young black guy about the same height. Did you notice anything distinctive about the robber? Scars, tattoos, the way he moved. The clerk had thought about it. He had a weird walk, like he was limping a little. On his left side, Tyrell had no limp, no prior leg injuries. Walked perfectly normally. Vance had presented all of this at trial with surgical precision. The corrected timestamp, the cell phone records, the clerk's uncertainty. He'd put Mrs. Hayes on the stand, and she'd been exactly what Maria said, devastatingly honest, detailed, unshakable. He'd put Tyrell on the stand, and Tyrell had told his story simply. He'd been at his grandmother's house. He'd never robbed anyone. The jacket was his, yes, but he'd bought it at a thrift store 6 months ago. The money was from his job. In his closing argument, Vance had walked the jury through reasonable doubt, not as an abstract concept, but as a concrete analysis of every shaky assumption in the state's case. The prosecution wants you to believe, he'd said, that Tyrell Hayes drove 60 miles in 17 minutes, robbed a store, then immediately returned to his grandmother's house and resumed texting his girlfriend. They want you to believe this despite phone records that place him elsewhere. They want you to believe the testimony of a terrified 19-year-old who said maybe when asked if he was sure. They want you to believe all of this because the alternative is admitting they arrested the wrong person. The jury had deliberated for 4 hours and acquitted Tyrell on all counts. The local news had picked up the story. Yale-educated lawyer frees innocent teen. The headline was reductive, but the exposure was useful. Other lawyers started referring clients to him. People who couldn't afford the white shoe firms but wanted someone who'd fight. Vance's practice grew. He hired 2 more attorneys, moved into a larger office, started taking more complex cases. Civil rights lawsuits against police departments for excessive force. Employment discrimination cases. Wrongful conviction appeals. He won more than he lost, but not everything. There were losses that stung, cases where he knew the client was right, but the evidence wasn't there, or the judge was biased, or the jury simply didn't care. The hardest loss came in his 5th year of practice. Martin Cruz was a 34-year-old construction worker who'd been fired after reporting safety violations at his job site. He'd filed a whistleblower complaint, and the company, Redstone Construction, a major Texas contractor, had systematically retaliated, denied him work, blacklisted him with other contractors, spread rumors that he was unreliable. Vance had taken the case on contingency and built what he thought was an airtight record. Emails from Redstone management discussing how to deal with the Cruz problem. Testimony from former employees about the company's retaliation tactics. Documentation of Martin's exemplary work record before the complaint. The case had made it all the way to the Supreme Court on a narrow question of statutory interpretation. Whether the whistleblower protection statute applied to independent contractors or only direct employees. Martin had been misclassified as an independent contractor to avoid providing benefits, which Vance had argued made the misclassification itself evidence of the company's bad faith. The court had disagreed, 6-3. Vance had sat in the courtroom and listened to the majority opinion being announced. A dense exercise in textualism that ignored the practical reality of how companies like Redstone weaponized worker misclassification. The dissent had been scathing, but dissents didn't pay Martin's mortgage. After the decision, Martin had been philosophical about it. You did everything you could, man. Sometimes the game's rigged. But Vance had taken the loss hard, not emotionally but analytically. He'd spent 2 weeks dissecting every aspect of the case, every argument he'd made, looking for what he'd missed. The problem, he'd realized, wasn't his legal analysis. The problem was that he'd framed the case as statutory interpretation when he should have framed it as constitutional due process. The majority had been able to hide behind textualism because he'd given them that door to walk through. He filed the inside away, and when the next 3 whistleblower cases came to him, he won all of them by reframing the arguments in constitutional terms, by closing the doors before the opposing side could find them. At 39, Vance had built something rare, a successful practice doing work he believed in, making enough money to live well without compromising his principles, and a reputation that brought in cases that mattered. He had a condo in downtown Austin with floor-to-ceiling windows and no roaches. He had a wine collection he'd assembled more for the intellectual exercise of learning about wine than for any particular passion for it. He had season tickets to the Austin Symphony, not because he loved classical music, but because he discovered he liked the discipline of sitting still and listening to complex patterns. He had no interest in marriage or children. He dated occasionally, relationships that ran their course and ended without drama. He had friends, other attorneys, a former professor from Yale, Sandra from his office, who became his managing partner. But he kept the relationships at a comfortable distance. He was, by any measure, successful and alone, and entirely content with both. The case that would define the next phase of his career came on a Wednesday in September. A 17-year-old named Devin Park had been charged with hacking into the Texas Department of Transportation systems and altering traffic light patterns, causing a pileup that injured 12 people. The prosecution was seeking to charge him as an adult, which meant potential prison time of 10 to 20 years. Devin's parents, a nurse and an electrician, had exhausted their savings on the first attorney, who'd advised them to take a plea deal. They'd come to Vance as a last resort. He didn't do it, Devin's mother, Suni, had said in their initial meeting. He's good with computers, yes, but he wouldn't hurt anyone. He wouldn't. Vance had interviewed Devin in the juvenile detention center where he was being held. The kid was terrified, but also angry in the specific way that innocent people get angry, outraged at the fundamental injustice of being accused of something they didn't do. I didn't hack anything, Devin had said. I mean, yeah, I've hacked things before just to see if I could, but nothing like this. Nothing that would hurt people. Tell me about what you have hacked, Vance had said. School website, to change my friend's grade from a C to a B. My parents' Netflix account to unlock the adult content. He'd had the decency to look embarrassed about that. Random corporate websites, just poking around. But it never damaged anything, never stole anything. It was just puzzles, you know? Vance knew. The prosecution's case was built on IP address logs showing that the traffic system had been accessed from an IP address that traced back to the Park's home internet connection. They had testimony from a cybersecurity expert who said the level of sophistication required indicated an experienced hacker. And they had Devin's history of minor hacking incidents, which the prosecution was using to establish motive and capability. Vance had hired his own expert, a woman named Dr. Rashida Okafor, who'd worked for the NSA before going into private consulting. She'd reviewed the access logs and the traffic system's security protocols. This is sloppy work, she told Vance. Whoever did this used basic tools that anyone could download. And they were routing through multiple proxy servers, which means the IP address the prosecution is relying on doesn't actually tell us what a hacker was. It just tells us one stop in the chain. Could someone have used the Park's internet connection without their knowledge? Absolutely. If their router wasn't properly secured, someone could have hijacked it. Or they could have been running a script that cycled through vulnerable routers in the area. Vance had Dr. Okafor examine the Park's home network. Their router was using default password settings and had never been updated. Anyone with minimal technical knowledge could have accessed it. But proving someone else did it was different from proving Devin didn't do it. Vance had gone back to the traffic light hack itself, studying the pattern of changes. The hacker had altered lights on a specific route through downtown Austin during rush hour, creating a cascade of backups that culminated in the pileup. Why that route? Why that timing? He'd mapped the route and realized it passed directly by the headquarters of Vanguard Systems, a cybersecurity company that had recently been in the news for a massive data breach. The breach had exposed personal information for millions of customers, and the company's stock had tanked. Vance had looked into Vanguard's competitors and found 3 companies that had benefited significantly from Vanguard's loss of reputation. One of them, Sentinel Security Solutions, had headquarters in Austin. It was speculative, but speculation was better than nothing. He tracked down a former Sentinel employee through LinkedIn, a programmer who'd left the company 3 months earlier. Over drinks, the programmer had been willing to talk. Sentinel CEO is a piece of work, the programmer had said. Obsessed with beating Vanguard. Used to talk about creative disruption all the time. What does that mean? I think it meant he was willing to do shady shit to get ahead. I left because I didn't want to be there when it caught up with them. It wasn't evidence, but it was a thread. Vance had pulled Sentinel Securities and Exchange Commission filings and found something interesting. The company had shorted Vanguard's stock 2 weeks before the traffic hack. They'd bet heavily that Vanguard's price would drop, and when it did, after the pileup led to questions about Vanguard's broader competence. Sentinel made a profit of $3 million. He brought this to Dr. Okafor. Could someone at Sentinel have done the hack? Could have? Absolutely. They'd have the expertise. Can you trace the hack back to them? With a subpoena of their systems, maybe. Without one? No. Vance had filed a motion to compel discovery from Sentinel, arguing that the trading pattern established sufficient suspicion to warrant investigation. The prosecution had fought it. The judge had been skeptical, but Vance had made his record carefully and thoroughly. And when the case went to trial, he'd put Dr. Okafor on the stand to explain how easily the Parks router could have been compromised. He'd introduced the Sentinel trading information. He'd walked the jury through reasonable doubt, step by careful step. The prosecution wants you to believe, he'd said in closing, that Devin Park, a 17-year-old with no motive, decided to cause a massive accident for no reason. They want you to ignore the fact that a cybersecurity company made millions of dollars betting against their competitor right before this attack happened. They want you to ignore the fact that Devin's family's internet connection was wide open to anyone who wanted to use it. They want you to ignore all of this because it's easier to blame the kid with the computer skills than to do the hard work of finding out who actually benefited. The jury had deliberated for 2 days. They'd come back deadlocked, 11-1 for acquittal. The prosecution had offered a plea deal, time served and probation. Devin's parents had wanted him to take it. Vance had advised them it was their choice. But if you want to fight, he'd said, I think we can win. They'd fought. The second trial, 6 months later, resulted in a full acquittal. The case had attracted significant media attention. Not just local news this time, but national coverage. Attorney exposes corporate conspiracy in hacking case. The headline was overblown. Vance hadn't proven Sentinel did anything, just raised enough doubt about Devin. But the attention was useful. More clients came. More complex cases, more opportunities to do the work that needed doing. Vance was 41, and he was exactly where he wanted to be. He thought about Hollister Street sometimes, late at night when he couldn't sleep. The roaches, the smell, his mother on the couch. He wondered if Crystal was still alive, if she was still in that apartment. He could have hired someone to find out. He never did. He thought about Mr. Casper more often. The old janitor had died 7 years ago. Vance had learned about it from an obituary he'd happened to see while searching for something else. He'd sent flowers to the funeral and a check to the library in Mr. Casper's name. A full scholarship fund for students who needed a place to study late. He thought about Natalie and Rebecca occasionally, curious in an abstract way about what had happened to them. Natalie had married a finance guy and moved to London, according to a Whitmore alumni magazine. Rebecca was apparently a federal prosecutor in Manhattan and being talked about for a judgeship. Good for them. He meant it. He thought about Tyrell Hayes and Devin Park and all the other clients he'd kept out of prison or won settlements for. He thought about Martin Cruz and the whistleblower case he'd lost and about the strategy he'd developed from that loss. Mostly, though, he thought about the next case. There was always a next case. At 41, Vance Walker stood in his office on a Friday evening, looking out over Austin's skyline as the sun set behind the hill country. His paralegal had gone home. His associates had gone home. The building was quiet. He had a case file on his desk, a police brutality lawsuit, 3 officers who'd beaten a man during a traffic stop, the whole thing caught on body camera, the department claiming qualified immunity. It would go to trial in 3 months. He would win it, or he wouldn't. Either way, he'd learn something, adjust his approach, and win the next one. The Roaches were very far away now, and they'd taught him everything he needed to know. How to stay still, how to wait, how to survive until the moment you could move. Vance Walker had moved, and he wasn't stopping. He picked up the case file and began to read.
Thanks for listening.